A few years ago, I went through something that shook the foundation of everything I thought I knew. My wife betrayed me. We had been married for more than 12 years, with a 9-year-old daughter who was the center of our world. My relationship with my wife wasn't fiery or filled with passion anymore, but I always saw her as my most trusted and cherished person. She wasn't just my partner, she was part of my very existence. Through all the ups and downs, I had stayed loyal. I had never even thought of being unfaithful to her. It wasn't something that ever crossed my mind. My wife, on the other hand, had long dreamed of having a second child. For years, she would bring it up, sometimes with excitement, other times with a subtle plea in her voice. But I always managed to sidestep the conversation, coming up with excuses that felt more like practicalities. I didn't feel ready to take on that extra responsibility. Life already felt like an endless cycle of work, bills, and making sure our daughter had everything she needed. There was always something. Either we were buried in credit, or I was concerned we wouldn't be able to manage financially if we had another mouth to feed. In truth, the idea just overwhelmed me, and I convinced myself that we couldn't handle it. I was determined not to break under the weight of it all, and so I kept pushing the question aside. At first, she accepted it, or at least it seemed that way. She didn't push too hard, but the disappointment was always there, lingering in the quiet spaces between us. While she masked it with a smile or with distractions, I could sense it in the way she sighed or the way her eyes softened when she looked at other families with more than one child. I told myself it was temporary, that she would eventually stop asking, that our life was complete as it was. Looking back now, maybe that was my mistake. Assuming everything would stay the same, that love would always be enough to keep the wheels turning. But I was wrong, so deeply wrong, and I didn't realize just how much that question of when had weighed on her until it was too late. One day, out of nowhere, she came to me with the news that took me completely off guard. She was pregnant. I remember the moment vividly, like time slowed down and the weight of her words pressed down on my chest. I didn't know what to say or how to react. A mix of surprise and unease washed over me. I hadn't expected this, not after all the times we'd skirted around the topic, not after I'd made it clear, or so I thought, that the timing wasn't right. And yet, here it was, happening before I could even process it. I stood there, stunned, my mind racing in 1,000 different directions. But instead of voicing any doubts or asking the questions that immediately bubbled up inside me, I stayed silent. I didn't want to upset her, didn't want to see the hurt flash across her face if I voiced my concerns. What if she thought I wasn't happy? What if she believed I didn't want this child? That wasn't it, of course. I wanted to be a father again, but everything felt so sudden, so unexpected. My silence was a mix of fear and hesitation, so I simply nodded, managing a faint smile, and we carried on with our lives as if nothing had changed. Deep down, though, I was holding my breath. As the weeks passed, I couldn't help but feel a knot of unease in the pit of my stomach, one that I couldn't shake. Something felt off, but I kept it buried, hoping that, in time, the excitement would take over and I'd settle into this new chapter of our lives. I remember thinking, maybe this is what I needed, what we needed, to reconnect as a family, to bring us closer again. Still, I couldn't help but wonder. I started to obsess over little details, over the things she said and didn't say, over the way she looked at me or avoided looking at me. I tried not to dwell on it, telling myself that everything would be fine once the baby was born. I tried to focus on the future, to imagine what our child would be like. And with every passing day, I found myself clinging to the hope that the baby would be like me, that there'd be no question, no room for doubt. And so, I waited for the moment when all my fears would be put to rest, for the day our child would arrive, and I could finally stop wondering. A boy was born. I still remember that moment, the flood of emotions, the way my heart swelled with the news. While I couldn't be there at the hospital right away, she sent me photos almost immediately. Our newborn son, cradled in her arms, wrapped in those soft hospital blankets. I stared at the pictures for a long time, longer than I'd like to admit, trying to process what I was feeling. He looked, well, not quite what I'd expected. Tiny, wrinkled, with a face that struck me as unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite place. When our daughter was born, I didn't feel this way, but I brushed it off, telling myself that all babies are a little funny looking right after birth. Still, something inside me stirred, a tiny, nagging whisper I tried my best to ignore. I scolded myself for such unworthy thoughts. He's just a newborn, I thought. They change so fast. Soon enough, I'll see him grow and those doubts will fade. And so, life moved forward. I threw myself into fatherhood, raising him, caring for him, and before I knew it, I truly loved him with everything in me. Yet, beneath that love, a quiet unease lingered. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many milestones we celebrated, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't anything like me. Not in appearance, not in mannerisms, not even in temperament. It became harder to ignore as he grew older. I'd look at him and search for any trace of myself, any familiar feature, some glimmer of resemblance. But it wasn't there. It felt like I was looking at a stranger sometimes. His features, so different from mine, stood out more as the months turned into years. His personality, too, completely distinct from our daughter's. She had always been quiet, thoughtful, reserved in her ways, while he was full of boundless energy, a whirlwind of emotion and unpredictability. I tried to tell myself it was just the nature of siblings, how they could be so different from each other. But there were other little things that gnawed at me. The way he smelled, oddly enough. His scent wasn't familiar, unlike my daughter's, whose presence had always been like a comfort to me. It was subtle but persistent, like some kind of invisible barrier between us. Occasionally, when the weight of these doubts became too much to bear in silence, I would gently prod my wife with questions. "Don't you think he's a little different from me?" I'd ask, my voice casual but my heart pounding in my chest. She always brushed it off with an easy smile. "He takes after me," she'd say. "It happens, you know? Not all kids look like their fathers. It's nothing unusual." And I wanted to believe her. I wanted to let go of the creeping uncertainty. But every now and then, when the quiet of the night set in, I found myself wondering, even considering the idea of a DNA test. I mentioned it to her once, half jokingly, testing the waters. "What would you say if I got a test done, just to settle this?" I asked. She didn't flinch, didn't seem offended in the slightest. "Go ahead," she said, without missing a beat. "I've got nothing to hide." Her answer should have reassured me, should have put my mind at ease. But, instead, it left me feeling even more unsettled, like I was still standing at the edge of some invisible line, unsure if crossing it would bring the truth I was afraid to face. I remember how deeply it grated on me whenever someone made a passing comment about how my son didn't look like me. It was a casual remark most of the time. Innocent, really. We'd be at a family gathering, or I'd show someone a photo of him, and they'd tilt their head, smile, and say something like, "He's got a different look, doesn't he? Doesn't really take after you." Each time I heard it, it was like a small knife twisting in my gut. I'd brush it off outwardly, laugh even. But inside, the doubts I'd been wrestling with for years only grew louder. Eventually, after 3.5 years of pushing those doubts down, I decided I couldn't live in that uncertainty any longer. I needed to know the truth. I made up my mind to do a DNA test. It wasn't an easy decision, but once I'd set my mind to it, I couldn't turn back. I took my son with me to the hospital, telling him it was just a routine checkup. He was cheerful as ever, not suspecting anything. We both gave blood samples, and for a moment, I was overwhelmed with guilt. What if I was wrong? What if this little boy, whom I'd raised and loved, was truly mine and I'd been doubting him all along? My wife found out, of course. Kids have a way of spilling the truth when you least expect it. He came home one day, all innocence and wide-eyed curiosity, and told her we'd gone to the hospital together. "We gave blood, Mommy," he said, without a hint of the gravity behind it. I didn't even try to deny it. There was no point. The truth was already out. The fallout was immediate. She exploded in anger, furious at the very idea that I would doubt her, that I'd put us all through such a thing. I remember her voice, sharp and cutting, as she hurled accusation after accusation at me, shouting about how I was humiliating her, how I was making a mockery of our family. "Why would you embarrass us like this? Why would you bring shame on our family?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. But I stood my ground. I had to. "I'm not trying to shame anyone," I replied, my voice as steady as I could manage, though inside I was shaking. "I just want to be sure. I need to know for certain that he's mine. I need that peace of mind. It's not about you. It's about me. I'm just a fool, but I want 100% certainty." I could see something shift in her then, like a dam had broken. Her fury gave way to a raw, almost panicked look, and in that moment, I knew. I knew before she even said the words. She didn't try to defend herself anymore, didn't keep up the pretense. Her voice was softer now, almost resigned, when she finally confessed. "There was someone else," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It was a few years ago. A short, intense affair, but it's over now. It ended as soon as I found out I was pregnant. I didn't know whose baby it was, and I couldn't bring myself to have an abortion. I couldn't kill the child. So, I broke things off with him and tried to move on, hoping he was yours. The room seemed to tilt, the air thick and suffocating. The words hung there, heavy between us. The revelation, though not unexpected, still hit me like a blow to the chest. It all made sense now. The doubts, the comments from others, the nagging feeling I couldn't shake. The truth, as bitter as it was, had finally come to the surface. But I wasn't ready for what came next, the overwhelming sense of loss, not just for the trust that had been broken, but for the family I thought I had, the life I'd been living, the years spent loving a child that might not even be my own. All those years, she said, she lived in constant fear that her deception would be uncovered, but deep down, she never truly believed I would go through with the DNA test. She told me everything, hoping I wouldn't open the envelope, hoping I would forgive, accept, and continue to call the boy my son, to hold our fragile family together. I stood there, staring at her, and for the first time in my life, I was utterly lost for words. How could anyone possibly put into words the devastation I felt in that moment? It was as if everything I had believed in, every truth I had clung to, had crumbled into dust before my eyes. The feeling was beyond pain, beyond betrayal. It was a gaping emptiness. It was like I had been walking down a road, steady in my direction, only to find it abruptly end in a vast abyss. There was no more path, nowhere else to go. My heart, my soul, both torn out, but I was still alive, forced to carry the unbearable weight of it all. I wanted to disappear, to vanish into nothingness. The shame, the rage, the sorrow, they crashed down on me all at once, a tidal wave of emotion that I couldn't escape. I packed my things and left. I didn't even have the strength to fight anymore. I couldn't bear the sight of her or the thought of facing my children. I just needed to get away, to breathe, to exist somewhere far away from the pain that was consuming me. In the days that followed, I sought help. I couldn't handle it alone. No one could. A therapist became my lifeline, guiding me through the darkness I had found myself in. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the results of the DNA test came back. By then, I was already prepared. I had braced myself for the inevitable. The cold, clinical voice on the phone spoke of alleles and markers, laying out in scientific terms what I already knew in my heart. I wasn't the father. The test confirmed that my paternity was excluded. I sat there in silence, feeling a strange mixture of numbness and clarity. This wasn't a surprise, yet it hit with the same force as if it had been. There was a finality in those words, a closure, but one that didn't bring peace, only devastation. Now, here we are. I am shattered. My wife suffers, racked with guilt, perhaps regret. The two children, innocent in all of this, suffer too. The life I once had, the family I built, it's all been torn apart, and there's nothing I can do to change it. She's begging me to come back, pleading with me not to destroy our family. She asks for my forgiveness, tells me she loves me, that it was a terrible mistake all those years ago. She even talks nonsense about having a third child, as if that could somehow mend the broken pieces of what's left between us. But I can't believe her. Not a single word. You see, no woman has a child with a man she doesn't love. It's impossible. So what does that mean? That she had no real feelings for me years ago, when she let this happen? That she's been living this lie, carrying this secret, all while I was still giving her my heart? I've been deceived for so long. I don't even know where the truth ends and the lies begin. And now, I'm at a crossroads, unable to see a clear way forward. The hardest part? The children. My daughter. I love her more than words can express. She's my heart. And even though he's not mine by blood, I've raised my son too. I loved him, believed he was mine for all these years. But something inside me has shifted. I look at him now, and it's as if a veil has been lifted. He's still a wonderful boy, but there's something different in my eyes now, something I can't unsee. It breaks my heart. It really does. He doesn't deserve this. None of this is his fault, and yet he's caught in the middle of this storm. I feel so much guilt, sorrow for him. Tears well up when I think of how this will affect him, but I can't help how I feel. I'm trying, but something inside me has shattered. I'm not the same person I was before all of this. What a catastrophe life has turned into. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the loss of trust. It's a pain that consumes you, pulls you into a place so dark and deep that it feels impossible to climb out. And as for what comes next, I honestly don't know.